Welcome to the True Brewer Stew podcast. Every other Sunday, we'll release an episode of the podcast featuring an interview with a business owner in the food industry. From restaurants, to breweries, to bakeries, and everything in between. We ask them about their journey and the process of becoming a successful business owner in hopes of helping others to do the same. I'm Mike Curtin, and the podcast starts now. Welcome to the True Brewer Stew podcast. My name is Mike Curtin. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so you never miss another episode of the podcast. Don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts. All links to those and podcast platforms can be found on TrueBrewerStew.com. Thank you for joining us for episode number 14 of True Brewer Stew. Today I sit down with Anthony Accardi, co-owner of Transmitter Brewing in Brooklyn, New York. Anthony tells us how their focus on certain styles of beer is how they stay ahead of their competition, and why they chose to make the move from Long Island City to Brooklyn Navy Yard. So here it is, episode number 14. I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, I'm Mike Curtin. This is True Brewer Stew, and today I'm at Transmitter Brewing with Anthony Accardi. Anthony Accardi and Rob Kolb met back in 2005 as amateur bike racers. Both had a mutual love for food and beer. It didn't take long till they started to home brew together, and thus Transmitter Brewing was born. In 2014, they opened in Long Island City, with their focus being on Belgium-inspired farmhouse-style beers. Business was good. In May of 2019, they moved to the new Brooklyn Navy Yard, Building 77, where they now call home. Anthony?
Hi, how are you? Thanks for coming by.
Cheers. Thank you for being with me.
Of course.
So first off, how did you guys come up with the name Transmitter and all the names of your beers, F1, T1, S4?
So we both live in Greenpoint. So, trying to figure a brewery name out, like any business name, is difficult. We named it after Transmitter Park, which is at the end of Greenpoint Ave.
Okay.
So that park was actually historically where WNYC moved their radio towers in the early 40s, I think. As the building started to interfere with the signal, they moved the radio tower across the river so that it would project to the city more directly.
Right.
So it was named Transmitter Park. There's still a short, squat building there that the radio station worked out of, like engineered out of. And so we named it after Transmitter Park. It didn't have any particular meaning, but at that moment, we thought we could be in Greenpoint. Right. We hadn't found real estate yet for a brewery. We had incorporated and all that, but there wasn't any real estate that was going to work for a brewery for us at that moment. But we already had a name. So
Gotcha.
We found, my wife was walking across the Pulaski Bridge, which connects Greenpoint and Long Island City, and saw a for lease sign on a little garage space.
Right.
And at that point, we were looking at all sorts of neighborhoods. That turned out to be beneficial, both because it was the right size, it was the right rent. It was literally a couple hundred meters from where I live.
Right.
So the first year we were working nights and weekends, so not having basically a second commute in the evening or weekends made it much easier on us.
Right.
Full-time job and then going to a brewery at night with a commute in New York City would be a pain in the ass. So,
Gotcha.
In terms of the name, so we decided not to come up with fanciful names for beers. We wanted to just sort of set it and forget it, essentially. So Our system is the letter represents the family or style of beers, and then the number is the actual recipe.
Okay.
And that's truly the name of the beer. That's what we register, and the rest of it is just word salad, essentially.
What is your description of farmhouse? Because it seems like people never seem to know exactly what it is. I mean, people describe it as like, well, it's a funky style. So to you, what is a farmhouse?
Our farmhouses always use some wild yeast in it.
Okay.
So they're basically, they can... Like our farmhouses, they can be like a pale ale, but with wild yeast. Some of them are more saison-like with a wild yeast. So again, it's kind of fast and loose in terms of how we consider what we're making in any given style, and that's true of the farmhouse. But our F series always has some wild yeast in it. It can have Saccharomyces as well. It can we can start a beer with normal beer yeast and then finish it with Brettanomyces. But it always has bread in it for us. I don't think that's the final definition of a farmhouse. Right. I mean, again, like saisons and farmhouse are of a spectrum. They're similar. They can even be the same thing. And that's certainly how we think about it.
Okay. And how did you go about choosing that form? I know you guys don't do really stouts or IPAs, stuff like that. You kind of focus in on that. What made you hone in on those?
There are lots of reasons. One is it's what we prefer to drink generally.
Okay.
The beers we make are supposed to be nuanced and very drinkable, restrained. We're not trying to make the most sour beer or the most hoppy beer or the most malty beer. I like them to be designed in a way that has sort of breadth and depth to it.
Okay.
Usually leaning yeast forward.
Right.
As opposed to an IPA brewery that's really driving flavor with hops,
right.
Or someone that makes more English style beers that would be driving flavor with malt. Gotcha. I think of our beers as being mostly about the fermentation.
Gotcha. I don't work too far from where Transmitter first was. My firehouse is maybe a mile away from there. What was the big transition for you going from Long Island City to Brooklyn?
So,
or the biggest change
right.
for you?
Lots of changes. So,
right.
In Long Island City, we ran out of space pretty quickly. It was pretty
right.
small. We were in just over 2,000 square feet.
Right.
We didn't really have a tasting room. We had some tables set up, and it worked well. We had a little bit of outdoor space and nice weather. There were things about it that were charming and interesting and worked.
Right.
But essentially, we were stymied by the limit of space. And beer, making beer is a volumetric activity. It takes up a lot of space.
Right.
So without high ceilings, you can't put in much bigger tanks. You can't stack pallets up too high. So really, we got to a point where we couldn't make any more beer than we were making already in that space. And so we couldn't grow. It took us a long time to find a space that was right. We weren't really seeing anything that we thought was good. So we were shown the space here at Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was actually twice the space. When we got here, it was twice what we have now. It was close to 15,000 square feet. We're in about 8,100. The ceilings were close to 23 feet high. It was big, open, column space. It had the right load for we knew it could handle a brewery.
Right.
The Navy Yard had an appetite for a brewery. The space that we're sitting in was actually leased originally by Brooklyn Brewery. And at some point, after they had signed a lease, they realized that they could stay where they are, essentially, backed out of the space. So the Navy Yard thought that a brewery was a good idea and continued along those lines. When we showed up, it took them a little bit of time to actually split the space for us. It took us time to build it. So from start to finish, it was close to 2 years. From basically starting to sign the lease to actually moving in. So,
and you both were balancing the Long Island City still being open and building here?
Yes. I mean, we built Long Island City ourselves, essentially.
Right.
We couldn't do that. Much too much work.
Okay.
Yes, we were meeting contractors and dealing with general construction issues, but
how was dealing with that, bouncing back in nonstop? Was it like a nonstop day for you, or
every day is nonstop day in the brewing world.
That could be a good thing.
Yeah. Construction actually went pretty well, generally. Like, I don't really have any complaints about construction. I know nothing goes exactly according to plan, but most of it stayed right on track. In the end, it probably took a month or 6 weeks longer than we had hoped, but we're talking about 4.5 months. It might have taken 6 months by the time we were done. Right. So within a range, it was way acceptable.
Yeah, that kind of comes with the just construction in general.
Absolutely.
I did that for many years before I was a firefighter, and it was just hey, this job needs to be done by April. Come September, we're still there.
Right.
When you first found, obviously Long Island City was probably way more affordable for the space and where its location. How did you go about finding funding to start Transmitter?
So LIC was started with our own money. We did it pretty efficiently. We were pretty small and paid for our equipment cash and rolled with it. So moving here was, this is 4 times the space. So
right.
Close to $1 million in construction.
Right.
That we funded with an SBA loan. Okay. So government funded loan, which is a good way to go for a small business. Bank money is hard to come by. Right. We still choose not to have outside investment. We've gotten this far without it, and someone coming in and taking a piece of the business, it's not worth it at this point. Right. I don't think they would give us what it's worth to us after working at it for 6 years.
Right. So far, so good.
Why
good. Change it up?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's something you never thought you had to deal with when starting the brewery?
That's a good question. What's interesting about my background is I've never worked for someone, essentially. I mean, I had a job in high school, but right. I started a business straight out of college. Okay. And so I've only ever owned my own business, and I'm not sure that there's anything that I'm surprised by or haven't thought. I've always worked for myself, so I've always done it all. My other business was also small. Different industry altogether, but I think I did that for 25 years, and I don't think I'm surprised by much. Honestly, it's all just work essentially. Right. That has to be done.
So you're pretty educated, to say the least, to start. What was the morale of your friends and family when you first were starting the business?
That's a good question too. My wife knows I've always been an entrepreneur. I mean, right. I went to college with her, although we didn't date at that time. So she's only known me as someone that did their own thing. It was time for me to move on from the other business. It had run its course, essentially. Starting a brewery at that point, she knew that I could make it work. Right. Starting a business from scratch always has its challenges. I'd say that in some ways, the first brewery, a Long Island City 1.0, whatever you want to call that, that was a little bit simpler in a way, simply because it was smaller, there was less on the line. Right. A year ago, once we moved here, there's a lot more to it. There are more moving parts. There's more on the line. I mean, SBA loan is collateralized against your home, essentially. It's one thing to lay out $80,000 or $100,000 in cash to start a brewery. It's another to lay that out as well as have your house collateralized.
Of course. So is it tough making the family and business both work together?
Yes. I mean, I think that's always true of entrepreneurs. Right. It's always challenging to balance work and home life. Our schedule is basically 12 days on and 2 days off. Okay. So
that's a lot of work.
So essentially we work all week, and then one of us works the weekend, and then you work the next week, and you get the following weekend off. So it's long stretches of work. Inevitably there are festivals or events that you have to set up and do on your supposedly off weekend.
Right.
And sometimes that's traveling or sometimes it's here in the city. But what it does is it throws a monkey wrench into potential plans to do something with your family on the weekend when you thought you were free. So that's hard. I'd say in general. And that's, but I think that entrepreneurs in general always have that issue, certainly in the beginning until stuff sort of smooths out a bit. But for us, we were in Long Island City for 5 years, and moving here, it's basically like starting again.
So you talk about doing festivals and whatnot. You have the New York State Craft Beer Competition in Rochester.
Mm-hmm.
How does it feel to win awards and have your beer recognized amongst all the beers in New York?
Right. It's always fun to be recognized for a particular beer, on the one hand. On the other hand, I do feel like there's some randomness in that kind of thing. Judging is hard, and I give credit to the people that do it.
Right.
That said, there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that experience of judging. I'm not saying, I would never say that bad beers win awards.
Right.
But I think that good beers can be overlooked in that setting, right? Like if someone's tasting 10, 15, 20 samples of various beers in a day,
it's gonna be a lot on the palate.
It's a lot to make sense of, for sure.
Of course.
The New York State, we've won a few of those. We just sent our beers out Friday for this year's competition.
Right. That's approaching 16th, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay.
We haven't gone up to the New York State version of CBC. But we don't visit it. But we sent a bunch of beer, and let's see. It's throwing spaghetti at the wall. Let's see what they think.
Of course.
The feedback is always helpful. It's always interesting to see how people perceive it, what they think in what I would consider a more objectified way, perhaps. So that's always good. We entered a contest in Central America, and they loved one of the beers and hated 3 of the beers. That's just how it goes.
Right.
But the feedback notes you can always take those into account and learn from them.
Right. So what quality do you think you possess that makes you a great owner?
I'm not sure I'm a great owner, so...
Well, so far, it looks like you're doing pretty well.
I think owning a brewery is about paying attention to details, and those details can be everything from keeping stuff clean to keeping stuff organized. It's paying attention to details. I think that's the basis of success in general. Assuming that you haven't ever made a perfect beer yet, which I don't think we have, you're looking for continual ways to make improvements, both to the process itself, to perhaps the ingredients, to the recipes, all the way through to how that beer is served in the tasting room. Right. There's no place that you don't want to stop looking at any one part of the whole system, because that would be neglect, and neglect is insidious.
So what do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned so far from this industry?
It's definitely, it's an interesting industry. I think people have talked about this before. Like, there's a general sense of sort of camaraderie and collaboration. I feel like if I need something, I can make a phone call to a local brewery, and if they can help, they will generally.
Right.
I have to say that, in 2020, the number of breweries that are still cropping up makes it competitive, and I'd say in some ways that's not something I would have foreseen.
Right.
Something I expected.
And how do you think you go about staying ahead of your competition?
We do focus on these Belgian and French inspired beers. So I think that's the focus of our marketing, is to have a niche, pay attention to the niche, try to make that better. There are a lot of people drink IPAs. A lot of breweries make IPAs, and in some ways, I'm not sure that that's a way that that would help us as a brewery directly.
Right.
It's really about finding a niche and having a point of view.
Right. So, how do you define success? And did you have a moment of success where you were like, "Wow, you kind of just hit it"?
I think Transmitter makes some great beers. That feels good. I think we're recognized by our peers as making good beers.
Right.
In some ways, that to me is one definition of success for us.
Right.
Success in a business is pretty easy to define in a certain way. Like, are you making money? Right.
Financially, of course. Right.
Or are you providing good jobs for people? Or,
right.
That's another way to look at it. We still have a lot to learn. We still have a lot of room to grow. We're still a teeny brewery. We've been here coming on a year, essentially, in a couple months. It's just now that we're starting to really add production capability. We added a couple larger tanks like 5 months ago, and those are fully online and producing larger quantities of beers, and that ramp is helpful. That's a minor success,
Right.
We're moving in the right direction. The tasting room, since we didn't really have like what I would call a proper tasting room in Long Island City, so I think we're showing some successes here in the tasting room in terms of people like it. Various kinds of people show up.
Right.
Sunday morning at noon, we'll have a bunch of young parents with strollers come in, hang out. That's kind of interesting. That didn't happen so much in the old location. There were always a few strollers, right. But so being sort of ingratiated into the Brooklyn Navy Yard community as well as the greater sort of community of this neighborhood, I think shows some success.
Right. I think it's huge because you have the big windows pretty much showing everything, and people walk by probably during the week and they're like, oh, definitely should stop by.
Right. Absolutely. We get people that, so they added a ferry stop to the end of a dock here. It's a couple hundred meters away in June or end of June or early July or something. So we are getting neighbors using that as a mode of transportation. It isn't the easiest place to get to. The subways are a few minutes walk away. And so having the ferry here is drawing the neighborhood down the hill a little bit and through to the ferry. It is super efficient way. If you're close to the ferry, it's a super efficient way to get around.
Right.
Wall Street is 6 minutes away on the ferry, and 34th Street is 8 minutes away. So that in it of itself is, people are walking by, and if they look left or look right, they see us here, and they're like, oh, the brewery's open.
Right.
And
I'm sure a day at Wall Street will drive you to drink. So,
certainly this week.
Yeah, right. Of course. So, obviously word of mouth and people seeing it and whatnot. And how do you go about strategies for marketing?
We use the usual Instagram as a sort of main focus of marketing. I'm not 100% convinced that Instagram is a superb marketing platform. I think probably it was more influential several years ago, like 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
I think the problem with Instagram now is that there is a lot of noise. There's a lot flashing past your screen every day.
Of course.
So knowing what that ROI is, like, what's the benefit of the work you're putting into that marketing is hard. We're slowly adding events here.
Okay.
I never wanted to be an event coordinator necessarily, but again, in 2020, having events at a brewery is interesting to people.
Right.
It gets them in. There's something besides beer, and as good as and tasty as beer is, it doesn't feel like it's enough with
Right.
so many breweries in the U.S. Like, there has to be another layer involved in that. You almost want to become like a lifestyle brand of some sort.
Right. What do you think's been the biggest change in the last 5 years for you and the industry?
So when we started in 2014, we opened in March of 2014 in Long Island City. There were under half as many breweries. At that point, the tasting room model was relatively new.
Okay.
So that was never on the radar as being anything that was going to explode the same way that it has. So the tasting room driving the success and distribution of the brewery, I think, is something that's really evident in the last 5 years. That's not something that in the beginning we had necessarily considered, which is partly why Long Island City was fine as a place to start.
Right.
When we realized that we needed to have more potential on-premise sales, we were able to pivot slightly and add a few picnic tables and grow that part in Long Island City, but it was still pretty diminutive and limited. Now we know that tasting room is a huge part of local breweries. As you're sitting in one now.
Right.
It is 25% of our space essentially. We're sitting in close to 1,800 square feet of tasting room. This afternoon, this place at 3:30 will be full up of beer fans.
Right.
Friends that are out to have a beer, like all families again, with kids, all sorts of different groups of people, like hanging out and having a moment at a brewery as opposed to any other choice. So,
Right. A normal day at the brewery, full day here, whether it's working, running the bar. What do you think the greatest joy you take away from being here at the end of the day?
I've always liked to make beautiful things, and so for me, that's really what it's about.
Right.
So in my previous life, I printed photographs for artists.
Okay.
I had a custom photo lab, and so at the end of that day, I was able to say that I made something that was beautiful.
Right.
And I think that at the end of a day here at the brewery, that's I gained similar satisfaction. That you can make something, you can finish your day and have said you made something beautiful.
Gotcha.
Most days.
Right. And if somebody wanted to open their own brewery, what advice would you give them? Something that you kind of wish you knew back then when you started?
So many things.
Do tell.
I think we made a mistake, and this is all 2020 hindsight,
Right.
but starting too small is difficult.
Okay.
Brewing is an infinitely scalable activity, essentially. It takes the same amount of time to brew 10 gallons of beer as it does to brew 1,000 gallons of beer.
Yes.
So if you're spending all your time making batch after batch of 100-gallon of beer, that's difficult work, and unfortunately, generally that should be a very small part of what you do during the day. And if it's not a big enough batch, you can't get enough beer made to be successful. That's the first thing. Like starting a small brewery in is really hard in some ways. I'd say make sure you have some money behind you. And I don't mean you need funding necessarily so much as it is not we're talking about 2020, we're talking about right now. It is super competitive. We're in New York City. There are a ton of breweries here, more every day. And on top of that, many breweries look to distribute in New York City because of the potential influence for their brand that it can have. So you're getting competition from within city breweries. That's fine. But you're getting like both national and international companies looking to distribute here, even if that's just sort of once in a while. They're as big as it is here. There are a ton of tap lines, but probably not as many as breweries that want to be here.
Gotcha. Did you have a funny story for us?
We naturally carbonate all our beer. So our cans, bottles, kegs are all naturally carbonated.
Okay.
That's probably in some ways the hardest thing we do technically. It's definitely not something that most breweries do. People force carbonate their beer, and it's a perfectly great way to make beer.
Right.
We chose to do it naturally by priming and redosing a little bit of yeast.
Right.
So we haven't early on, we definitely had some spritzy beers as our learning curve, on the learning curve.
Right.
We started canning about 2 years ago, give or take. We did a lot of testing beforehand to figure it out, make sure that can conditioning was going to work. There's no reason why it shouldn't. We just wanted to make sure we knew that it was going to work the way we expected it to. And
okay.
We did have a batch of beer in cans that was a little bit overcarbonated, and it was the middle of summer, and then basically we started hearing popping from the small warehouse area that we had. And so we had to dump an entire batch of cans. That had never happened beforehand to us. And just putting that thing onto a forklift and putting it into the back of a garbage truck was really intense and hairy and funny.
I'm sure. It was heartbreaking a little bit as well.
Absolutely. The only thing worse than that would be to have that happen out in the world.
Right.
So to have that problem and catch that at the brewery is an acceptable solution for that problem for sure.
Right. Sorry to hear that. So we're going to do a little segment called Quick Fire 5.
Okay.
5 quick questions. 1 to 5 word answer. All right. Favorite style of beer?
Saison.
Saison. Favorite brewery besides your own?
I'd say let's go with Off Color.
Off Color. Okay. Favorite seasonal beer?
Wow. I never think about beer as seasonally that way. Let's go with just a light lager.
Light lager. Okay. Favorite beer and food pairing?
I'd say a Saison and mussels.
Mussels. Nice. Yeah. Barrel aged, imperial, or both?
Not imperial. Barrel aged is good.
Barrel aged.
Yeah. I mean, funky sour barrel aged.
Funky sour barrel aged just sounds delicious.
Yeah.
I think I had one of those by Grimm once before that actually caught. I'm not a big sour fan.
Okay.
But I had one and I was like, wow. It's delicious. Well, that's all I got for you, Ant.
Okay.
Ant, thank you very much.
Sure.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for being with us.
Thanks.
I'm Mike Curtin for Chew Brewer Stew, here with Anthony at Transmitter Brewing in Brooklyn. Thank you very much, man.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. Hey, guys, so that was the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you're able to take something away from that interview, as you will with every interview. Special thanks again goes out to Anthony Accardi from Transmitter Brewing in Brooklyn, New York. If you're ever roaming around the Brooklyn Navy Yard, stop by Building 77 for a couple of delicious farmhouse ales. Or swing by your local distributor and pick up a couple of their beers. Every other Sunday I'll be posting a new podcast, so stay tuned and, like I said, subscribe, and you'll never miss another episode of the podcast. Don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts for videos, clips of the interviews. Also, if there's something you're curious about knowing from the owners, then I want to ask it. You can email me directly at chewbrewerstew.com. Once again, I'm Mike Curtin for Chew Brewer Stew. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.